My mother snapped. Family comes before vacations. After everyone demanded I give up the dream getaway I'd saved and planned for months to watch my brother's children. I smiled, switched my phone to airplane mode, and let them handle their own emergency. The problem started about 6 weeks before I was supposed to leave. I had spent most of the year tightening my budget and saying no to stupid purchases. I was trying to build one real break for myself instead of another long weekend where I just sat on the couch and told myself it counted as rest. I had booked the trip months earlier. It was the first vacation I had planned just for me since before the pandemic. It was also the first time in my adult life that I had paid for the whole thing myself without borrowing from the future or pretending I would pay myself back later. I had flights, hotel, rental car, and 2 pre-booked excursions lined up. I had even arranged my PTO around it so nothing could touch those dates. I was proud of that in a way that felt almost embarrassing. I had never been one of those people who talked about self-care like it was a personality. I just knew I was tired. I worked full-time. I covered extra hours whenever I could. I helped my mother with her bills when she fell behind. I watched my brother's kids whenever everyone needed a favor. I drove people to appointments. I gave money when somebody was short. I fixed things. I showed up. That was the role I had somehow ended up in. The dependable one. The one who did not make scenes. The one who was always supposed to be flexible. For a long time, I had told myself that was fine. It felt easier than being the guy who said no and made everyone uncomfortable. Then I started realizing that every time I made myself smaller for the family, somebody else got to make themselves louder. The vacation was my line in the sand. I had not planned it as a dramatic statement. I just wanted sun, quiet, and a few days where nobody needed me to solve anything. That should have been simple. It was not. My brother Dan had 3 kids. At the time, they were 6, 4, and barely 2. He and his wife, Melissa, were always one minor inconvenience away from a full collapse. One daycare closure turned into a family crisis. One sick day turned into an emergency. One flat tire turned into a week of panic. I understood the stress. I really did. Kids changed everything. Schedules got ugly. Money disappeared faster than anybody expected. But understanding somebody's stress does not mean you become their backup plan for every single disaster they fail to prepare for. Dan and Melissa had been together long enough to know they needed a better childcare system than guilt and last-minute texts. They just never bothered building one. They assumed the family would absorb the chaos. Usually that meant my mother. When my mother got tired, it meant me. The first time I heard there was a problem, I was sitting at my kitchen table, looking over my trip confirmation emails. My mother called and sounded unusually calm, which should have tipped me off right away. She told me Dan and Melissa had a situation. Their regular babysitter had quit with almost no notice. Melissa had work changes. Dan could not take time off. My mother said the family needed to pull together. I asked what that had to do with me. She said it like the answer was obvious. She said I was not married. She said I did not have kids. She said I had flexibility. That word always made my jaw tighten. Flexibility was what people called it when they expected you to give up things they would never give up themselves. I told her I was leaving in 6 weeks and my dates were locked. I said it before she could make the conversation emotional. I said I was not changing my trip. There was a long pause. Then she said that vacation could be moved. I remember looking out my window at my driveway while she said it. I remember feeling the first real irritation settle in my chest. I told her the reservation was non-refundable. I told her I had used points and paid deposits. I told her I had arranged my PTO with my manager months earlier. I told her no, I would not be canceling. She changed her tone immediately after that. It became the tone she used when she wanted me to feel guilty for something she had decided in advance was my fault. She said family comes before vacations. She said Dan needed help. She said the children were innocent. She said I was being selfish. I asked her if she had volunteered. She said she already did too much. I asked her if Dan had asked anybody else. She said that was not the point. The point apparently was that I was the easiest person to pressure. I was annoyed, but I was not worried yet. I thought this would be one of those family arguments that burned hot for a day and then died down once everybody realized I was serious. I should have known better. The family did not think of my vacation as a real commitment. They thought of it as a hobby, something decorative, something a serious person could sacrifice without actually losing anything important. That attitude was not new. The difference was that this time I had already spent too much money to back down. I had also reached a point in my life where being available to everyone else had started to feel like a quiet kind of fraud. I was tired of being praised for being easygoing, while other people made plans around my time like it was communal property. I had not said any of that out loud yet. I was still trying to be polite. That was probably a mistake. Dan called me 2 days later. He did not open with small talk. He went straight into the problem. He said the sitter situation had fallen apart completely. He said Melissa could not miss work again. He said the kids would need somewhere to go while they scrambled. He said the trip was only a week, so it should not be that big of a deal to postpone. I listened longer than I should have. I remember the exact feeling of that conversation. It was the sensation of somebody slowly trying to slide my own plans off the table while acting like they were helping me tidy up. I told him no. I told him I was not available. I told him he and Melissa needed to find another solution. He got quieter after that, which was somehow worse. He said he knew I liked being helpful. He said I was the only person they could count on. He said the kids loved me. He said Mom thought I would understand. I told him understanding was not the same as canceling a trip I had planned for months. He sounded offended by that, which made me realize he had not called to ask me. He had called to pressure me. That stung more than I wanted to admit. The next round came through the group chat. It was me, my mother, Dan, Melissa, and a couple of my aunts who never missed a chance to join a family crisis if it gave them a reason to weigh in. Melissa said they were in a bind. My mother said I needed to be the bigger person. One of my aunts said children come first. Another said family steps up. Nobody asked what I wanted. Nobody asked how much money I had already spent. Nobody asked whether I had planned this trip around a rough year that had included 12-hour workdays, a breakup, and months of eating cheap lunches so I could afford something nice. The whole thing became a performance. They all acted like they were talking about weather or traffic or something just happening to them. I was the only one treating it like a real decision with real consequences. I said no again. I said I was sorry their sitter backed out. I said I hoped they found someone. I said I was not canceling my vacation. My mother responded privately after that. She told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. She said Dan had a real emergency. She said I was behaving like a child. That one made me laugh, which was probably rude. But I was alone in my kitchen and nobody could see me. It was absurd. I was the one being asked to drop everything because somebody else did not plan ahead. Yet I was the childish one for refusing. I did start doubting myself a little after that. Not because I thought I was wrong, because guilt is sneaky. It finds the cracks in your reasoning and starts living there. I remembered being a kid and hearing that family was supposed to be there for each other. I remembered my mother working herself into the ground for us after my father left. I remembered how often she had reminded us that people who loved you showed up when it mattered. That history had weight. It always did. I hated that part of family arguments. The past gets dragged into the room and set on fire every time someone wants a favor. I also knew that the version of family my mother liked to talk about was not the version we lived. She had no trouble using loyalty as a weapon when it benefited her. If I needed help, suddenly everybody was too busy. If Dan needed help, the entire family calendar became a moral issue. That inconsistency had been bothering me for years. I had mostly ignored it because it was easier. The vacation changed that. I tried to let the subject die. I muted the group chat. I stopped answering family calls after work. I kept saying no whenever somebody tried a fresh angle. My cousin called to say the kids would be devastated if I did not help. I told her I was sure they would survive. My mother called again, and this time she sounded angry instead of disappointed. She said she could not believe I was abandoning my own family over a vacation. I told her it was not abandonment. I told her it was a trip I had planned and paid for. She said I was being cold. I asked her if Dan had offered to reimburse the money I would lose by canceling. She ignored that and repeated that family comes first. That phrase started feeling like a shortcut for whatever she wanted me to do. It meant family comes first when I am the one sacrificing. It never meant family comes first when someone else needed to give something up. The worst part was that the pressure kept coming from directions I had not expected. An aunt I barely spoke to left me a voicemail saying my mother was stressed and I needed to stop being stubborn. A cousin texted me a picture of the kids from some birthday party and said they were such sweet little guys, as if that solved anything. Dan started talking around me instead of to me. He told relatives I was being unreasonable. He acted like I had made a promise and then broken it. That was when I started paying attention more closely. I went back through our texts. I checked the original family group messages. There was no promise. There was no agreement. There was only pressure. They had all decided I was available before I ever spoke. That was the first time I stopped feeling bad and started feeling angry. Not explosive angry. Cold angry. The kind that makes everything clearer instead of messier. I began saving screenshots, every text, every accusation, every line where somebody implied I had agreed when I had not. I do not know why I started doing that exactly. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe I was already sensing that the story would change later and I would need proof. Either way, it was the smartest thing I did in the whole mess. I also started looking back at old family patterns with less patience than before. It was strange how once you stop giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, all the little things they used to get away with suddenly look arranged. Dan had borrowed money from me twice and repaid me late both times. My mother had told me to let it go because he was under pressure. I had driven their kids to school more than once when both parents claimed they were running late. I had covered an emergency grocery run when their account was overdrawn. I had bailed on dinners because they needed a sitter. I had been 100 tiny safety nets stitched together by guilt. No one had ever called it that. They called it being a good son and a good brother. There was a difference. A good son helps because he cares. A good son is not supposed to be used as a default system because other adults cannot manage their own responsibilities. I think I knew that deep down, but I had not been willing to say it plainly until then. A week before my flight, my mother invited me over for dinner. That in itself was suspicious. She does not invite people over for dinner unless she wants an audience. Dan and Melissa were already there when I arrived. So were the kids. The house had the energy of an intervention that had been disguised as meatloaf. Nobody said that out loud, of course, but that is what it was. My mother had set the table like everything was normal, and then spent the first 10 minutes talking about how hard things had been for everyone lately. She made sure to mention how busy Dan and Melissa were. She made sure to mention how much the kids needed stability. She made sure to mention how nice it would be if people could put aside selfishness for 1 week. I kept my face neutral and ate my food. I had learned that if I argued too early, she would call me emotional and dismiss everything I said, so I waited. Eventually, she turned the conversation toward me and asked whether I had really thought this through. I told her yes. She said it was not too late to change the dates. I told her it absolutely was too late. She looked at me like I was disappointing her on purpose. That look used to work on me. It did not work anymore. I had spent too much money and too many hours on this trip to fold because she wanted me to be the family volunteer. She raised her voice then, not enough to yell, but enough that the kids got quiet. She said family came before vacations. She said Dan needed me. She said I was the only one making a big deal out of this. That was when I understood something important. She was not trying to solve a problem. She was trying to reestablish the family hierarchy. I was not supposed to win an argument. I was supposed to be reminded of my place. That realization made me strangely calm. I told her as evenly as I could that I was not canceling my trip. I told Dan and Melissa I hoped they found childcare. I told my mother that I was sorry she was upset. Then I stood up and left before the conversation could turn into screaming. No one chased me. That surprised me. I thought somebody might follow me into the driveway and keep pushing. Instead, I got one text from Dan before I reached home. He said I was letting the family down. I did not reply. I sat in my car for a minute before going inside and felt my hands shaking with anger. It was not dramatic. It was just the body catching up to the part of the mind that had been pretending to stay calm. I remember sitting there and thinking that if I gave in now, I would never hear the end of it. Every future event would become proof that my time was optional. Every holiday, every birthday, every emergency, I would be the guy who folds. I did not want that life anymore. The week before the trip was miserable in a very ordinary way. Nobody did anything huge. That was almost worse. The constant drip of little comments did more damage than one big blowout would have. My mother called to say she had no idea why I was acting so out of character. Dan sent a message saying he had already told the kid's uncle was helping out, and now he had to explain disappointment. Melissa forwarded a sitter's search list to the family chat with a passive-aggressive note about how hard it was to find last-minute help. One aunt suggested I should remember what the holidays would feel like if my mother ever stopped inviting me. That one genuinely made me stare at my phone in disbelief. The whole family was acting as if the existence of my vacation was an act of hostility. I was not stealing anything from them. I had simply refused to donate my plans to their chaos. That somehow made me the villain. At work, I was barely holding it together. I would answer emails, attend meetings, and then stare at my calendar like the trip itself was a rumor. I was afraid they would somehow keep the pressure going until I cracked. I had one coworker ask me if I was excited. I almost laughed because I was so used to being cornered by family that the idea of simple excitement felt fragile. I told him yes. I did not explain why I said it like a man escaping a crime scene. I knew if I survived the family storm, I would need the trip to actually feel like mine, so I tightened up everything. I made lists. I double-checked reservations. I printed documents. I set travel alerts. I moved money around. I did everything I could think of that would make the trip impossible to ruin. I wanted 0 loose ends. That was probably me trying to control what I could before the family tried to take the rest. 3 days before my flight, the emergency finally got ugly enough that I understood why they had wanted me so badly. Dan's sitter had not simply quit. She had quit after the family had promised her more hours than they were paying for and then started changing the schedule on her. Apparently, she had enough. According to Melissa, she was done being treated like an on-call servant. That part should have made them reflect. Instead, it just made them panic harder. I learned later that they had been counting on me because everyone else had eventually said no. My mother had been the last fallback. She had a part-time schedule, but she had already agreed to help one afternoon and wanted nothing more, so they came back to me with even more pressure. Now it was not just about convenience. Now it was a real emergency. Now there were actual children and actual work shifts and actual consequences. I still did not agree. I told them I was sorry their plans had collapsed. I also told them their bad planning did not become my emergency just because they waited until the last minute. That line did not go over well. My mother accused me of acting superior. Dan accused me of not understanding how hard it was to raise 3 kids. I said I understood it was hard. I said I also understood that being tired was not the same thing as being entitled to my time. There was a long silence after that. It felt dangerous in the way quiet sometimes does right before a door slams. Then my mother told me that if I walked away from family now, I should not expect anybody to help me later. That was probably supposed to scare me. It did not. It made me realize she had just admitted the whole system worked by threat. You comply or you get isolated. That was the deal. I had never seen it stated so clearly. The night before I left, I packed slowly. I kept waiting for a final call. It came just after 8. My mother did not waste time. She said the children had nowhere to go for the next day. She said Melissa had cried. She said Dan was at his limit. She said she needed me to do the right thing. I asked her what the right thing would have been if the roles were reversed. I asked her whether she would cancel her own long-awaited trip for somebody else's bad planning. She said that was different. Of course it was. Everything was different when they were the ones giving things up. I told her I would not be changing my plans. She asked me if I really planned to leave them stranded. I said they were already stranded because they had built their plans around my surrender instead of their own responsibility. That was the first time I heard her actually lose her composure. She was furious. She told me family comes before vacations with such force that it almost sounded rehearsed. Then she said I was making her choose between her son and her daughter-in-law. I told her she should not have to choose because no one had asked her to solve my vacation. She hung up on me. I finished packing and set my alarm. I slept badly. That happened even though I knew I was doing the right thing. Guilt does not vanish just because you have proof. It just gets quieter. The next morning I drove to the airport with my stomach in a knot. I half expected another round of calls in the parking garage. There were 4 missed calls from Dan by the time I got through security. There were 2 from my mother. There was one group message that said the kids were confused and upset that I was not helping. I did not answer any of them. I found my gate, bought coffee I did not want, and sat there watching people bored while my phone kept lighting up. I remember the exact moment I decided I was done. Not done with the family forever, done with being their first reflex, done with letting them train me like I was a resource and not a person. I switched my phone to airplane mode. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a practical one. I did it because I wanted my seat on that plane to be unreachably mine for the first time in years. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the signal disappear. The weird thing about turning your phone off when people are upset at you is how fast the silence becomes peaceful. I had spent weeks bracing for explosions. Instead, I got takeoff. I got clouds. I got the first real quiet I had heard in months. By the time I landed, I had already stopped flinching every time I thought about my family. I turned my phone back on long enough to check for anything catastrophic. There were 26 missed calls. There were more texts than I bothered counting. My mother had sent a message saying she could not believe I had actually done it. Dan had sent a message saying the kids had been crying. Melissa had sent one saying I was heartless. Another aunt had said she hoped I was proud of myself. One cousin had sent a dramatic paragraph about family values. I read all of it at the airport, then put the phone back away. I was not in the mood to fight, while standing under fluorescent lights with a suitcase and a coffee that had already gone cold. The trip I had been dreaming about for months was right there. I was not going to let their panic drag me back into the mess before I had even left the terminal. The first day of the vacation was almost awkward because I was so used to being on guard. I kept expecting some new crisis to pop up and yank me back into family mode. Instead, I checked into the hotel, dropped my bags, and stood on the balcony looking out at the water. I remember thinking how strange it was that I had to go so far away to remember what peace felt like. I did not do anything fancy that first evening. I ate by myself. I walked around. I bought a stupid, overpriced dessert and did not feel guilty about it. I slept without waking up every hour to check my phone. That alone made the money worth it. Then, on the second day, I got a message from my cousin that changed the whole shape of the story. It was not angry. It was almost confused. She asked whether I had really never agreed to watch the kids. I wrote back asking why she was asking. She said my mother had been telling people I promised to help and then bailed at the last minute. I sat on a bench near the resort walkway and just stared at that message for a while. There it was. The part I had suspected but not yet seen clearly. They had not only pressured me, they had rewritten the story. I was not just being shamed, I was being lied about. That was the moment I stopped feeling even a little bad. My mother had gone to the rest of the family and told them I had committed to childcare. That was why everyone was so certain I had abandoned them. It was not a misunderstanding, it was a fabrication. I went back through the screenshot folder I had started building and realized I had exactly what I needed. I had the original texts, I had the group messages, I had the private messages where I had clearly said no. I had everything. I did not send it immediately. I sat on the beach for an hour first. I wanted to be calm when I responded. I did not want to sound vindictive. I did not want to argue. I just wanted the truth to stand on its own. I sent the screenshots to the cousin who had asked. I included the date and time stamps. I included the messages where I had refused multiple times. I included the message where my mother had said the vacation could be moved. I included the part where Dan had told me he had already explained to the kids that I would help, even though he had never gotten my agreement. Then I said I had never promised childcare, I had never agreed to cancel my trip, and I was done discussing it. I did not send the screenshots to everyone. I sent them to one person because I knew family gossip would do the rest. That was enough. Within an hour, I started getting new texts. Not apologies, not yet. Just the thin, awkward shift that happens when people realize they have been repeating something false. My cousin said she had no idea. Another relative asked if my mother had really told everyone I agreed. One aunt who had lectured me days earlier went silent. Dan did not message me until that evening. He said Mom misunderstood. I almost laughed out loud at that. Misunderstood was what people called it when they did not want to say lied. I did not answer him right away. I let that sit. The trip itself got better once the family nonsense stopped leaking into every hour. I took the excursion I had booked and actually enjoyed it because nobody was calling me every 20 minutes. I ate meals at a normal pace. I took dumb photos like a tourist. I bought a shirt I did not need. I stayed out late one night because I could. It sounds small now, but those were the first days in a long time where nobody needed me to justify my own existence. That was worth more than I had expected. I think that is what made me so furious later. Not the babysitting demand itself, the assumption behind it. My family had treated my time like a placeholder they could overwrite at will. Once I saw that clearly, I could not unsee it. The real emergency on their side turned out to be expensive, exhausting, and exactly as avoidable as I had predicted. Dan and Melissa had to scramble for a paid sitter at the last minute. My mother covered part of the cost because she had already promised to help and felt responsible. Dan was irritated because he had to miss a shift. Melissa was angry because she believed my refusal had forced them into a bad financial decision. They did not see the irony in blaming the one person who had warned them for weeks that they needed a backup plan. That was the kind of family logic I had spent years tolerating. Something goes wrong. Someone else absorbs the consequences. When that someone else finally says no, they become the problem. I heard later that the emergency sitter charged almost 3 times what they usually paid. I also heard that the kids were fine. Tired, confused, and eventually fine, which was what would have happened if they had hired the sitter in the first place instead of assuming I would rescue them. I did not feel guilty about that part. I felt relieved. When I came home, I expected coldness. I got something stranger. I got silence. My mother did not greet me with the usual dramatic speech. Dan did not call. Melissa did not send a follow-up message. For 2 days, the family behaved as if nothing had happened. That was suspicious enough to make me. Then my aunt called and told me my mother was embarrassed. Not sorry, embarrassed. That was important. Embarrassment means the performance failed. It means someone saw behind the curtain. My mother had told multiple people a version of events that did not survive the screenshots. That mattered to her more than she would ever admit. She liked being the one who knew the moral shape of things. Now she had been caught making one up. A few days later, she asked me to come over. I almost did not go. Then I decided I wanted the conversation on record in my own head, if not on paper. So I went. She looked tired when I got there, not defeated. Just tired in the ordinary human way that happens when a person has had to live inside their own bad choices for long enough. She did not apologize right away. She started by saying the family had been under a lot of stress. I let that sit. Then she said she had only repeated what she thought was going on. I asked her what exactly she thought was going on. She did not answer that directly. Instead, she said Dan had made it sound like I had offered to help. I pointed out calmly that I had the texts. That made her flinch. She hated being corrected with evidence. It stripped away her ability to talk in circles. I told her I had never agreed. I told her she had told people I did. I told her that it embarrassed me. She finally admitted that she had assumed I would change my mind once everyone pressured me enough. That was the closest thing to honesty I got from her in the whole affair. I told her that was not how adults should treat each other. She said she knew that now. I did not say anything for a second because I could hear how much work that sentence cost her. I was angry, but I was also a little sad, not because I thought I owed her forgiveness on the spot, because I realized how much of our family had been built on this exact habit. Assume, pressure, rewrite, move on. I had let it go on because it was easier than fighting every time. That trip was the moment I stopped. Dan called a few days after that. He sounded less aggressive and more annoyed in the tired, practical way of a man who had been forced to look at his own mess. He did not apologize either, not really. He said he was sorry the whole thing had blown up. He said he was under a lot of pressure. He said he thought I would help because I always did. That one stung because it was honest. He was not evil. He was lazy in the way people get when they are used to someone else carrying weight. I told him I understood he was stressed. I told him that did not make my vacation optional. I told him he needed to stop telling people I had agreed when I had not. He got defensive and said Mom had just been trying to keep the peace. I said she had not kept the peace. She had made a lie sound official. That ended the conversation pretty quickly. He did not like hearing that. Neither did I, but it was true. The fallout lasted a while. There were some awkward family dinners. A few people were careful around me after the screenshots started floating through the family grapevine. My mother still tried to salvage her version of the story now and then, but it had lost its power. People had seen the texts. That is the thing about receipts. They do not get tired. They do not get emotional. They just sit there and keep being true. My aunt stopped lecturing me. My cousin stopped assuming I was always available. Dan and Melissa found a more expensive but reliable sitter network and stopped asking me for last-minute miracles. My mother remained a little icy for a couple of months. Then quietly she started asking me things with actual notice. Not favors disguised as emergencies, real questions. That was a huge change for her. I wish I could say it happened because she suddenly became wise. It did not. It happened because the old method failed. She learned that if she wanted my help, she would have to treat my time like it belonged to me. I wish I could say I handled all of it perfectly. I did not. I was sarcastic a few times when I should have stayed quiet. I probably enjoyed their embarrassment more than I should have. I definitely held the screenshots too long before sending them and let myself simmer in resentment instead of just ending the argument sooner. But I do not regret taking the trip. Not for a second. It was one of the best weeks of my life, not because of the scenery or the hotel or the excursions. It was good because I learned something I should have known earlier. People who benefit from your silence will always call you selfish when you stop giving it, and people who truly respect you do not need to be convinced that your time matters. They already know. A few months later, my mother brought up the trip again in a different context. It was after a birthday dinner for one of the kids. She said she had not realized how much I needed the break. That was as close as she ever came to an apology. I accepted it for what it was, not enough, but something. Dan did not bring it up anymore. Melissa still gives me a slightly careful look sometimes, like she is checking whether I am about to say no before she asks anything. That is fine. It is healthier than assuming I will always fold. The kids were never the problem. They were caught in the middle of adults who had gotten too comfortable using guilt as a scheduling tool. I still see them. I still show up for birthdays and school events and the normal things that actually matter. The difference is that I now choose those things instead of having them assigned to me by pressure. That changed everything. Looking back, the funniest part is that my mother thought saying family comes before vacations would break me. What actually broke was my willingness to keep being the automatic sacrifice. Once I saw the lie clearly, I could not unsee it. I had been acting like being easy to use was the same thing as being loving. It is not. The trip taught me that the hard way. I came home with a tan, a lighter bank account, and a much better understanding of my family. I also came home with something else. I came home knowing that when I finally stopped answering the phone, the world did not end. They handled the emergency. They always could have. They just wanted me to believe they could not. That was the real story. Not that I abandoned anyone, that I refused to be available for a lie. And for the first time in my life, that felt better than being the good son.